Hey guys, welcome to the next part. So in this part we're basically going to be learning how to create a Konami style texture, hopefully very quickly. This is a great technique if you're creating a player that either doesn't have an awful lot of photo reference data, or for a player that you actually don't want to spend an awful lot of time on, because some players, especially young players, you want to create something that looks half decent, but you don't necessarily want to spend hours and hours and hours doing it, because who knows if they're actually going to be good long term. So for a player like this, I tend to start creating other elements of the head that you can't get from the front texture using Konami textures. So if I show you here, so this is Balotelli's texture, and we're going to use this area for the top of Martial's hair, and as you can see on the photo that I've pulled up here, that seems pretty suitable. For the lower part of the hair, which is very, very short, we're going to base it on Theo Walcott, as you can see here, so it'll be this sort of area here. And for the main skin texture, it will be Sterling, from Liverpool, Raheem Sterling, as he's got a very, very similar skin tone. So we're going to use that as our kind of base skin texture, and you'll see how that works in a moment. So what I'm going to start by doing is just copying and pasting these elements into my document here. So that's Sterling, that's Walcott, and that's Balotelli. So let's quickly name those just so we don't lose track. And then this is Martial's face texture that we generated for just the front area there. So the thing to do is sit your face front.png in front of your main skin texture. So we're going to use Sterling as the base, and then the thing to do is to very, very quickly, with a soft brush of a good size, is to basically scrub away any parts that don't really work for you. So that's in there. And the great thing about using this technique with layer masks, which you generate from down here, is you can add and remove. So if you use black, then a black brush, then it removes things. If you use a white brush, then it paints it back in. So you've never lost anything, which is kind of important in this technique. So the next stage is to get the top part of the hair sorted out. So we'll create a layer mask on Balotelli's layer, and what I'm going to do now is actually invert this mask. So you'll see this change from white to black. So you use Control and I to invert, and then we can paint back in with white. So if we just paint in the areas that we actually need, which is approximately that. So that should probably do for that section. So the next thing we're going to do is do the same with the Walcott layer. So we're going to enable Theo Walcott, we're going to give him another layer mask, and we're going to invert that as well, and we're going to start scrubbing in some of the hair data onto our model where we think we're going to need it, which to me looks probably about like that. So as you can see, we're now basically, we've now got a much more sort of finished looking texture very, very quickly. And this is what this technique is all about. It's not going to be super accurate, but it's going to be good enough. So I'm pretty happy with that, really. there's some blending that we can do, but generally, because we've chosen the right players with the right skin colours, then it kind of works. The only thing I'm not quite happy about is the darkness of Walcott's skin in comparison to Sterling's. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and just ever so slightly change Walcott's skin tone. So the way you can do this is by creating a adjustment layer, which is down here, that only operates on Walcott's layer. So if you press Alt on your keyboard and then choose whichever adjustment layer you think will help, so levels, and then tick this, use previous layer to create clipping mask. And basically what this means is this levels option will only work on those particular areas. So I'm just going to darken that down a tiny bit, just so it matches the skin tone a little bit better. It's not a huge change, but it just helps it to blend. And I'm also going to drop the saturation a little, so I'm going to do the same process and then just drop the saturation down a tiny bit. And quite often you'll find if you create a levels layer that you'll actually need to drop the hue saturation, because bumping up and down levels can actually affect the saturation quite a lot. That's very, very subtle. You might not be able to see that on YouTube, but believe me, it does help to blend it into Sterling's texture a lot. So the next thing we're going to do is work on Martial's layer to try and get him to blend in a little more with the Sterling texture in the background. Now we want to leave this area up here, because really this is his hairline, this is accurate, so we don't want to mess with that at all. What we want to do is to try and certainly start to remove elements that are of no use whatsoever. So you can see there's plenty of bugs around the mouth. We're going to start working to remove those. You can see errors in this area here. So what you can do with these areas is just paint them out very quickly. Just paint them out like that, and the same here. Just paint them out, leaving as much as possible of the original texture, but just removing what you definitely don't need anymore. Again, with the nostrils we can paint those in, and around the eyelids as well is another important area to try and remove elements that don't seem to work very well. So just do this, get these elements removed. They should still work fine because we aligned our model to these elements. We basically match the textures, so they should work absolutely fine. The next thing to do is to remove any very, very bright points of light. There's one just under here as well that I'll delete. And what I'm now going to do is start softening some of the other areas where you've got very bright areas. So for here, for example, just start softening those down. And a bit up here as well. We want to try and remove any highlights that don't really work. And obviously any areas of shadow that don't really work as well. So perhaps some around here. That's generally pretty good. So perhaps again just soften some of this area down. And around here. Just so we're just trying to make the texture as even as possible at this stage. And the next stage is basically going to be to try and colour match this in. So now that we've done that, I know it doesn't look like much at the moment. I'm just going to soften some of this area down again. But basically the thing to do next is to create some of these kind of layers for your Martial layer. So if I start by doing a levels, and we'll use the previous layer again to crop the data, and we'll just make that a little darker. We'll create a hue saturation layer, and this is where it starts getting clever. So the thing that we can do with this, which should give us a pretty good result fairly immediately, is to colorize this layer and choose the correct hue and the correct saturation for this layer. What you can also do with this layer is to actually reduce its opacity. So if you run with the opacity slider up here, you can actually change its influence. So you can still get some of the color data. You can obviously also remove areas. So if you wanted to keep the lips in full color, then you can actually just, you know, remove those areas, again using your black brush, because it's created a layer mask there for you. But that's the basic technique. So now that we've got it a little bit better color matched, we can just start removing elements which we don't think are necessarily going to work. I want to remove that shadow under his nose. And any of these sort of stretch lines where the texture's been slightly warped, we'll remove those as well. Up here, perhaps. So what I'm going to do now is drop this hue saturation layer down to 50%, so we've got more of the colour data showing through. And now I'm going to create a levels layer that works solely on areas of lightness on this layer. So select your colour range, select that, and it will start to select any areas which are too bright. So again, use the same process, create a levels layer, and now you can operate just on those areas, darken those down a touch. And as you can see, we're actually starting to blend the texture quite well now. It's not perfect yet, but it's getting there. Again, just start softening some of these out. I need to paint some of this back in. And paint a little bit more of this out. Now certainly in this area down here, we've obviously got a problem on this side with the shadow. It's going to be very, very difficult to cut through. But we'll deal with those in a second. So basically you just need to keep working like this to blend the texture through. And honestly, it really doesn't take very long to do. It's just using your artist's eye, I suppose. So, based on the hue saturation, we do actually want the lips revealed. So we'll get the colour data back from the lips. And we'll also pull a little bit of colour data back from the hair. So we just created that layer there to balance up the two sides a little bit better. So once you've got to the stage where you're relatively happy with one side, what you can start doing then is actually creating mirrored sections to balance out the texture. So for example here, if we create a center line actually very quickly, just so we know where the center point is of the document, which is there. If we copy this mouth element using Shift, Control and C and then paste that in, what we get is a pasted layer that includes all of the image data below. So we can flip that and drop that over the top there. As we can see, if we just lower the opacity of that, actually that's in pretty much exactly the right place. But it's taken out an awful lot of that stuff that we didn't want. So we can also obviously add layer masks to that and paint out elements that we don't want. We can make sure that there's less mirroring going on by just scrubbing away certain areas, perhaps using a lower opacity brush to just knock back the texture a little bit, so there's a little bit of randomness and chaos to it, so it looks a little bit more natural. But actually, when all said and done, that texture will probably work just fine. So if we go ahead and just save this, let's just start by saving it in the Marshall folder, just so we've got a Photoshop copy. And now we're going to go ahead and save the DDS in the GDB folder. So it's a good idea at this point to just make a copy of your face DDS and then just save it over there, DXT5 again, and just save. And now we can go into Blender and actually preview this. So if you reload that image, then it will pull the new file in, and as you can see, I mean, you know, immediately that looks a lot better. It looks a lot smoother, a lot more even, and it'll work a lot better in game basically. The bits that I'm not happy about at the moment are, it seems a lot darker on the cheek on this side. There's some weird texture elements going on in the eye area, which I don't like. Definitely some shadowing, and also the eyebrows need to be evened up. This eyebrow is very dark, this one's very light at the moment. You can see it on the texture there. So we'll go in and we'll change those. So I'm going to fast forward this bit just so you can see what happens, but not necessarily take it all in. So now that those elements, the eyebrow and the lightening of the cheek on that side, have been sorted, the next thing I'm going to do is try and fix the eye areas. So on this lower eyelid, I don't like this texture that's been generated here, and again it's very dark here. We need to try and remove that. I'm going to try and soften some of these elements up here a little bit as well, and definitely remove the deep shadowing on this side, and possibly over here as well. one way to do that, obviously, would be to basically, again, take your central point and go ahead and copy the sort of eyebrow area that you want to use, the area that you want to fix. So copy there using Shift, Control and C, and then paste that in, and pop that to the top, and then flip that horizontally, and make sure that's obviously aligned like that. That will give you a proper overlay. So we want to keep certain elements of this, and we want to remove certain elements. So I'm going to use a fairly large brush and with black, and just start scrubbing back some of these parts that we want to keep, like the eyebrow, because we don't want the eyebrows to be mirrored. I want to soften some of the areas around here as well, perhaps a more opaque brush, because we don't want the texture to look symmetrical. We just want areas of shadow to be removed. So the next thing to do is to try and get back some of the image data from under here in this area. So it actually looks a lot better. Use a slightly like that. And we'll actually scrub back a bit more on this as well, because this lower area is actually pretty good on this side. I quite like it, so we'll get that back. And we'll save that and have a very quick preview in Blender and see how we're looking. So again, that's definitely a lot better. As you can see, it's created an error up here, but all we need to do there is just blend that in. So make sure we've got a nice large brush and just blend that back like that. Possibly we want to take back some of these areas because there's some quite nice detail back here that makes it non-symmetrical. And the other part that I'm actually going to edit as well is I'm going to take another slice from up here. I'm going to copy that there and make a paste of that part there. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because here you've got a bit of Sterling's eyebrow showing through, so this layer here is actually showing through in this part here. We're just going to try and remove that very quickly with another layer mask. We'll scrub out most of the data and just cover up that particular area that we don't want anymore. It just helps to soften that a little. So I think all in all, that's working pretty nicely. You know, obviously you can spend a lot more time on this particular part of the process, but that should give you a good idea of actually how you can use Konami faces to create, you know, a texture that overall works much better. You know, it's not perfect, but it will do the job for a quickly created player. One thing that we could do actually, because this area seems quite dark, is go back to our Photoshop document and literally just completely lower the opacity of the Walcott layer, which will give us a lighter hair area, probably about there. So we try saving that again. So now if we compare that to the photo, it looks a lot better. So there we go. I think the next part is going to be purely based on trying to fix any remaining 3D modelling issues before we then start work on the normal maps and the specular maps. So I'll see you in the next part for fixing the final 3D elements.